The Constitution specifically grants certain powers to Congress. Those powers are called enumerated powers. The Necessary and Proper Clause allows Congress to pass laws necessary for carrying out these enumerated powers. However, the 10th Amendment reserves all powers not delegated to the federal government for the states. Using its authority under the Necessary and Proper Clause, Congress established and regulated federal prisons soon after the nation was created. But Congress became worried that some federal prisoners would harm the public after being released. To address this concern, Congress passed a statute authorizing the civil commitment of mentally ill and sexually violent prisoners, even if they'd already completed their sentences. In 2006, Grayson Comstock and 4 other men were serving time for crimes involving sexual violence or child molestation. The men were in a federal prison in North Carolina and had almost completed their sentences. But in the last days before their scheduled releases, the United States Attorney General began proceedings in a federal district court to have the prisoners committed for being mentally ill and sexually dangerous. The prisoners challenged the civil commitment statute as unconstitutional and moved to dismiss the proceedings. The district court agreed with the prisoners and granted the motion to dismiss. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit affirmed, ruling that the statute exceeded the powers granted to Congress by the Constitution. The United States Supreme Court granted cert to review. The only issue before the Supreme Court was whether the enactment of the civil commitment statute exceeded the permissible scope of Congress's power under the Necessary and Proper Clause. The federal government argued that the clause authorized the statute, which was necessary to carry out Congress's enumerated powers. The prisoners disagreed, claiming that the relationship between the statute and Congress's enumerated powers was too remote for the clause to apply. The court held that Congress had sufficient authority under the Necessary and Proper Clause to allow for civil commitment of mentally ill, sexually dangerous federal prisoners following their prison sentences. Justice Breyer, writing for the majority, held that the statute was a constitutional exercise of congressional power. The court, citing McCulloch v. Maryland, noted that the Necessary and Proper Clause doesn't require a law to be absolutely necessary for carrying out an enumerated power. Instead, the law just needs to be rationally related to a goal within the proper scope of congressional power. Breyer wrote that Congress has long had the ability under the Necessary and Proper Clause to criminalize conduct that interferes with Congress's enumerated powers. Congress can define federal crimes, which means that it must have the power to create federal prisons. And because there are federal prisons, there must be laws to regulate those prisons. The court ruled that the civil commitment statute was rationally related to the goal of prison regulation for 3 reasons. First, the statute was similar to other federal laws related to mentally ill prisoners. Second, the law helped protect the community from dangerous prisoners. And third, the statute respected state interests under the 10th Amendment by allowing states to take responsibility for the prisoners if they wished. Because the civil commitment statute was constitutional, the Supreme Court reversed the appellate court's decision and remanded the case. Justice Kennedy concurred. Kennedy agreed that the statute was constitutional, but urged the court to adopt a more restrictive test for cases involving the Necessary and Proper Clause. Kennedy also felt that the majority didn't show enough deference to states' rights under the 10th Amendment. Justice Alito concurred on the narrow ground that the statute was necessary to safely operate federal prisons. Alito was otherwise concerned that the standard used by the majority was too vague and would improperly expand the scope of federal power. Justice Thomas dissented. Thomas thought that the statute was unconstitutional because it infringed on states' police powers under the 10th Amendment. Thomas also believed that any law passed under the Necessary and Proper Clause should be no more than 1 step away from an enumerated power. Justice Scalia joined Thomas's dissenting opinion but disagreed with his interpretation of the clause. The 1819 case of McCulloch v. Maryland was one of the earliest and most well-known cases to consider the scope of congressional power under the Necessary and Proper Clause. Only United States v. Comstock and a few other cases since McCulloch have addressed the tension between this expansion of federal power and the preservation of states' rights.